The next step in this build is the bottom chord of these arch trusses. So to start out, I've got my SketchUp drawing, and that is telling me a couple things. It's telling me the length of each segment that I need, as well as the angle that I need to cut it at. So as you can see right here, I've got one side of one arch right here. So starting from the middle point, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 segments. These 3 are all equally cut at equal lengths, and then I leave the last one a little bit long just to help the top and the bottom piece bend. That's going to be 3/8 thick, and leaving it as long as I can here will help that bend a little bit further, even though I'm going to be cutting it off at about right here. So you want to have as many segments as needed to make the grain flow. If you go with segments that are too long, the grain can look choppy as you see it heading in straight lines and then cutting over. I think that 4 is going to work good for this. So I'm going to be cutting about 1 inch off as I turn this into the actual arch. So I've got one side completely cut. This would be the right side, and then these pieces right here will be the left side. I'll end up putting dominoes in here, gluing, and then using pinch dogs to pull it together and let that dry. But now I'll walk you through the process and show you what it looks like cutting these pieces on the miter saw. Alright, so I've got my drawing here. I know from my SketchUp drawing that my miter cut needs to be at 3.4 degrees. And then I know from my SketchUp drawing what the length of each equal segment needs to be. So I have the saw set at 3.4 degrees. I'm not going to be going back and forth. Rather, I'm going to actually be flipping the piece over back and forth as I cut this to do what I need to do. You just want to be really careful to make sure that you don't accidentally forget to flip the piece over, so on and so forth. Otherwise, you'll end up with your grain not flowing like you want to. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a pencil line across the top of the board, and that's going to help me to keep track of which side of the board is the outside. So I've got crown out, crown up. So this is the outside of the board, and I can start cutting now. One other thing, as I make each cut, I'm going to label each miter intersection. So this is going to be the middle, this is going to be A3, A3, B3, B3, D3, which is the end. That way I can also keep track of what joint goes together in case they get mixed up down the road. So on my last section, or half of one side, I started with my first cut being the middle cut of the truss. So now, because I don't have a full 14 foot on this side to cut this, I need to start with my bottom of the arch on this side. So rather than the middle, I'm starting with my bottom cut here first, which is a longer piece. So then I'll label them accordingly, and I'll end with the middle cut up here. That's the process on how to make the cuts for one entire side of an arch. If it was a smaller arch, I would try to use a 16-foot board and just keep the grain continuous throughout the whole thing. But because this is too large, I'm making my splice in the center, and the grain direction is what it is at that point. But this is a total of 8 pieces here. I need 4 sets of these, so I'm going to keep going with that now. Okay, so now all of my segmented arches are cut. Each one of these stacks represents the bottom chord of the truss, just one side of it, which is about 16 foot long. So the next step is I've got to put a bunch of mortises in all these and join them together with dominoes. The way they are right now, an end grain glue joint, has no strength. So I'm going to try and put a few good sized dominoes in each of these joints, and I've done that in the past and it's worked out really well. Okay, so now we're on to arch assembly. Here I've got a half of each side put together and glued up. There are 3 dominoes in each joint, and I'm using pinch dogs here. So I'll walk you through that process on how I'm putting these together. The first thing I need to do before I domino these is mark my domino locations. So I know that I'm going to be cutting 1 inch off of the top of each of these joints because I've laid that out in SketchUp. So I basically put my dominoes where I thought it would work best, and it worked out good to go 2.5, 5.5, and 9. So I'm just going to mark 2.5, 5.5, and 9 down from the top on all these joints, and then I can domino them. Now I've got all of my mortise locations marked, so I'm going to go ahead and mortise all these. One note, if you're finding that as you're putting things together it's too tight and it doesn't want to go together, one tip that you can do is increase your plunge rate as you're plunging with the domino, and that makes the hole a little bit more sloppy and actually gives it a little bit more room. But I've already done 2 other segments here, and a moderate rate seems to be working pretty well, so I'm not going to risk going too fast and possibly breaking the bit because I don't have another one on hand right now. I actually very rarely use my domino, but there's certain applications where there's just nothing else does the same job. I use a biscuit joiner a ton for on-site work, but in a case like this, a biscuit is more designed to flush things and doesn't give a ton of, I guess, breakage strength, whereas a domino, I don't know what kind of tension you would call that, but it's just a lot stronger, and whenever you put it into a joint like this, it's going to keep that board a lot straighter from going this way, whereas a biscuit doesn't help you at all from allowing the board to do that number. It's really just flushing the joint and giving a little bit of tearaway strength. So I prefer a domino by a mile for joints like this. So now the assembly process is pretty straightforward. We're going to glue these joints really well, make sure the dominoes are coated really well. This is red oak, and the open end grain on red oak really makes the glue soak in and go into those pores really quickly. So I like to give it actually 2 coats. I'll just put 1 coat on here, and I'll let that sit and kind of tack up just a little bit so that it doesn't keep soaking into those pores. I'll coat the other side. And now I'll move on to the dominoes. I'm going to put a generous amount of glue in each of these mortises to make sure that I'm getting squeeze out. And then I definitely recommend, I mean, strength is really important on this kind of a joint where it's up in the air and has some stress on it, especially during installation. Really want to make sure that these tenons are coated with glue really well, that way we don't have dry joints anywhere. See, as I'm sticking those in, they're going in pretty easy, but still plenty tight enough that the glue is squeezing out and coming up around these slots that are milled into the sides of the domino. So all my squeeze out now, I'm just going to smear over the rest of the joint. Again, not too much glue, but enough to make sure that we've got solid coverage. Kind of coat these dominoes again. And we'll move back over to this one, and I will coat it lightly again. And we don't want to have too much buildup, otherwise it won't go together well. Then I'm going to drop some glue in these slots here also. So now's the fun part. If you've done everything right, it should go together really well. And you might be wondering, well, how do you put clamping pressure on a joint like this where you can't clamp? And the answer to that is pinch dogs. You see the wedge right here? As you drive that in like a nail, it's going to pull the workpiece together. And again, I'm cutting an inch off the outside here, so as long as I keep my pinch dogs out here, I'll be cutting that area off, and then I won't have any nail holes. You can see as I hammer that in, the glue squeeze out is coming out of the joint. So I've got squeeze out the whole way now. And I actually like to drive it in through the end grain also. So now that joint's done. I'm ready to move on to the next one.